Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I was on the third coffee of the morning, sitting in the shade of our prefab mobile command trailer, when the screaming started. The sound didn't come from our side of the fence. It floated in across the border, distant at first, like a truck's failing brakes echoing down a canyon. It rose and broke in waves, desperate and raw. I set the mug down on the ammo crate beside me, its ceramic clink sharp against the background hum of cicadas and wind. At first, I thought it was a local protest again. Maybe one of the small border villages on the other side was having another dust-up with the militia. But this wasn't that. You develop a gut for things after 2 decades working in conflict zones. Mine had been honed from Fallujah to Kunduz, from sweeping old Soviet tank routes in Georgia to rebuilding anti-vehicle corridors near the Golan Heights. And this was wrong in a way that went bone deep. Something primal. The zone we were working in was an old stretch of the demilitarized buffer between Serbia and Kosovo, a forgotten relic of a war that ended decades ago. Officially decommissioned in 2008, the field was still littered with landmines and unexploded ordnance. Our job was to clear it for redevelopment. Wind farms, they said. Power transmission corridors. My name's Eric Calder. Former 21E, now working for Kestrel Dynamics, a UK-based private contractor that specializes in EOD, explosive ordnance disposal, for hostile and contaminated environments. I'm not a soldier anymore, but the habits die hard. When that screaming started, I instinctively scanned the horizon, unholstered the M9 I kept at my hip, and stepped away from the trailer. We were a team of 8 on site that day. Mila Pavlovich, our Serbian liaison and former army sapper, was marking detonation zones with surveyor flags and recording coordinates on her Trimble GPS unit. Jackson, Big Texan, ex-Navy EOD, was inspecting a cluster of PMA-3 anti-personnel mines that we'd carefully exposed for later demolition. 2 drone operators, Simon and Dima, were parked in a climate-controlled trailer, their feeds buzzing with thermal scans and overhead imagery. Lena, our medic, was inside the container sorting medical kits and labeling the fentanyl lockbox. And Dom and Andrich were out near the tree line, laying charges for a controlled blast scheduled for that afternoon. A heavily fenced corridor separated us from the border proper. 2 layers of high-tensile razor wire and motion-triggered floodlights surrounded the zone. The area between was a legal deadland. No civilians, no foot traffic, no reason for anyone to be out there. Which is why, when I saw movement on the far side of the minefield, staggering figures breaching the brush, slow and jerky, I radioed immediately. Eyes on. Contact 12 o'clock. Roughly 5 mics beyond the perimeter. Mila, you seeing this? Her voice crackled back. Affirmative. They're not supposed to be out there. Civilians? Not sure yet. I raised the Leica rangefinder and locked onto the nearest figure. Mid-30s male, it looked like. Shirtless, covered in grime or blood or both. He wasn't walking. He was listing forward like a drunk, his feet dragging in the soil, ignoring the natural obstacles around him. Behind him, maybe 6 or 7 others followed, similarly erratic. Mila jogged over, scanning with binoculars. What the hell are they doing? Simon's voice chirped in from the drone trailer. We've got heat signatures. 23 bodies moving toward a restricted zone. No vehicles, no weapons detected. Speed is inconsistent. Looks like a herd of drunks. I adjusted the zoom. That wasn't mud. Their skin was gray, blotched. Some had visible wounds. One woman's arm looked broken backward at the elbow, but she didn't react to the limb dragging behind her. None of them were responding to each other or to the debris underfoot. One stepped directly onto a coil of rusted barbed wire, tearing open their foot, and kept walking like nothing happened. Dom's voice crackled in next. "Boss, you seeing this from the ridge? We've got a trail of them coming through a breach in the far fence. Looks like they ripped through it." Jackson frowned. "That's not possible. That fencing's reinforced NATO grade. You don't tear through it by accident." And then the screaming started again, closer now. A child this time. Shrill, wordless. I didn't hesitate. "Pull everyone back to safe distance, prep for lockdown. Mila, get the comms array powered. We need to alert KF4 Command in Pristina. Something's wrong on the other side of that line." 5 minutes later, the lead figure hit the edge of the minefield. We watched, breath held, as the man stumbled forward, directly onto the flagged detonation zone. A PMA-2 pressure mine, one of the oldest Yugoslav types we'd uncovered that morning, sat just below the topsoil. His foot landed on the disc. Nothing happened. We stared. The PMA-2 was notorious for being unstable and sensitive to as little as 5 kilograms of pressure. But the mine didn't go off. Either it was a dud or something had gone wrong with the arming process. Then the second man arrived. He was limping, his entire left leg a slick of blood. He walked directly behind the first, also across the marked danger zone, and kept moving. Then the third, then the fourth. Still no detonation. "Either they're getting incredibly lucky," Jackson muttered, "or something's off. They're not reacting to the signs, the flags, the fencing." "Nothing," I said. Mila stared at the closest one through her binoculars. "Eric, their eyes. They're black, like completely gone." My gut dropped. Lena appeared at the command trailer's doorway. "I've just spoken to the regional emergency center. There's been a situation near Podujevo. They're saying outbreaks, attacks, some kind of infection, hospitals being overrun, locals fleeing toward the border. How many? Dozens, maybe hundreds. It's unclear. The network dropped mid-call. They said..." She hesitated. "They said the infected don't feel pain." 3 more figures crossed the minefield. One tripped over a flagged tripwire. An old prom one bounding mine. This one detonated. The explosion echoed across the valley like thunder. A plume of dirt, metal, and flesh geysered into the air. When the dust cleared, we saw 3 others still moving, one missing an arm entirely, another with both legs shredded below the knee, dragging themselves forward. Still moving. Still silent. No screams. No pain. I locked eyes with Mila. "Back everyone off. We're going to have to reroute the evacuation trail and prep the convoy. If they reach the secondary road, they'll breach the fence and be on us in under 20 minutes. "Convoy's on site," she said. "We got the Land Cruiser, the Hilux, the Medvan, and 2 quads. Load what you can. Bring demo charges, medical, water, fuel. Strip non-essentials." "What about the charges we planted near the ridge?" "They stay. We may need them." She nodded and ran. I radioed Dom and Andrich. "Guys, you need to pull back. Regroup at staging point Alpha. We've got incoming." Dom responded immediately. "We're on the move, but, boss, we spotted something else. There's a group, civilians, hiding near the tree line, maybe half a click west of the breach. Kids. One of them's got a flag, waving for help." I checked my map. "They're inside the buffer?" "Yes, sir. They must have come through the river crossing." "Any infected near them?" "Not yet, but if they're not moved soon..." "Damn it." I clicked the radio. "We'll intercept. Hold position until we arrive. Then we extract together." We only had one path open, a narrow, unmined strip that wound through the field to a former watchtower. It was cleared 2 weeks prior and marked with reflective tags, but the edges hadn't been checked for pressure plates or bouncing mines. One wrong move meant a corpse, or worse, triggering a blast that attracted everything in earshot. I led the way. The sun was merciless, baking the gravel underfoot, the haze of heat rippling through the air. Jackson followed in the Hilux, its reinforced chassis rattling over uneven dirt. Mila stood in the bed of the truck, scanning the horizon with her scoped AUGA-3, her finger ready on the trigger. In the distance, the infected were spreading across the landscape. Some wandered into deeper parts of the minefield. Detonations flared and echoed, but they just kept coming. Relentless, unfeeling, unstoppable. When we reached the tree line, the family stepped out. A man, early 40s. His wife, 2 kids, one maybe 8, the other just a toddler. The older boy had the flag, waving it above his head like a surrender. Their faces were hollow with exhaustion, clothes torn from barbed wire and brush. The man collapsed to his knees when he saw us. "Molem, Voss," he said in a cracked voice. "Please." Behind them, I heard more movement. Branches snapped to our left, dry and deliberate. Not the random rustle of wind or wildlife. I raised my sidearm instinctively, motioning for the family to stay down. Mila swept the rifle left, zeroing in on the shadows. Then, a second family emerged. 3 people, elderly couple and a young woman, maybe late teens, blood on her jeans and no shoes on her feet. She was limping, clutching a blood-soaked towel wrapped around her arm. "They're coming through in groups," Mila muttered. "These people must have broken from the village in waves." The realization hit me hard and fast. This wasn't a random scattering of survivors. There was likely an entire pocket of civilians trapped behind the fence, trying to find any gap, any route across the former DMZ, and they were walking straight into an active minefield while being hunted. Dom and Andri broke cover from the ridge and jogged down toward us, each carrying their rifles low and packs over their shoulders. Dom looked like he'd aged 5 years in the last hour. "We saw another group," he said, sweat running down his neck. 20, maybe 30 people moving parallel to the riverbed. No weapons, but... He hesitated and then added quietly, "They're being followed." "Confirmed infected?" "Yeah," Andre replied, his voice gravel. "Some of them got dragged down before they could scream. One of the biters tackled a man into a ravine. They didn't get back up." I looked at the families around us, especially a toddler now curled into his mother's lap. They had no idea what they'd wandered into. "We can't hold here," I said. "We're too exposed." Jackson pulled the Hilux up behind me, the diesel engine knocking rhythmically. Simon's voice came over the radio from the drone trailer. "Eric, you've got about 3 dozen heat signatures closing in from the southeast. I can't confirm if they're infected or just panicked civilians, but they're all moving fast, faster than the groups we saw earlier." "Understood. Prep the second drone. I need real-time imagery focused on the corridor between us and the access road near grid 223. "Copy that. Uploading in 30 seconds. I turned back to Mila. "We're going to shepherd these people through the cleared corridor. I want Jackson leading in the Hilux. We'll put the families in the Land Cruiser. We walk the perimeter. No one steps outside the flagged lines. Dom, you and Andri run tail. Shoot only if you have no choice. Sound draws them in." She nodded once and started translating to the civilians, walking among them, her Serbo-Croatian fluent and steady despite the rising panic. We'd spent weeks clearing this route. It was maybe 2.3 kilometers from the tree line to the old watchtower gate where we had our fallback position. The path curved slightly to avoid cluster munitions buried deep in the soil. some submunitions that never detonated properly. Every square meter outside the flags was a gamble with death. As we started moving, I looked back one last time toward the far ridge. A figure stood at the crest, arms limp at its sides, head twitching slightly. It didn't follow. Not yet. But as the wind shifted, I caught the faint copper scent of blood drifting in its wake. We walked in tight formation. Jackson drove 20 meters ahead, keeping a slow, even pace so the group could follow behind without splitting. I stayed at the rear left, eyes constantly flicking between the flags and the brush beyond them. The terrain here was sun-scorched clay with tufts of wild grass that blew like dry tinder. The heat was getting worse. The digital thermometer clipped to my vest read 39.5 degrees Celsius. It wouldn't just be the infected we had to worry about. Heat stroke was a real threat, especially for the kids and elderly. We hit the first bend in the trail and paused. There was an old sign, partially buried in soil and flaking paint, that read, "Mine, do not approach." Beyond it, on the left side, a decomposed animal carcass lay half sunk into the ground. A boar, split open from midsection to snout, ribs turned outward like splintered wood. Flies buzzed around it, thick and loud. One of the men gagged. A woman covered her child's eyes. "We move fast here," I said. "This is where the density increases." Mila translated again, firm and calm. We kept moving. We made it halfway before the first shot rang out. A single crack behind us, followed by shouts. I spun and saw Andres drop to one knee, firing a controlled burst from his Zastiva M70 into the tree line. One figure dropped, twitching. Another emerged, lurching through the brush with half its jaw missing and a bone protruding from its collarbone. 3 more behind it. I keyed the radio. "Engaged rear, infected in pursuit." Simon responded instantly. "Visual confirmation on drone. You've got another group coming in hard from the west. If they hit the south slope, they'll intersect your path in less than 5 minutes. I turned to Dom. "Fallback point?" He pointed toward the right flank, where a small depression dropped into a natural gully between 2 ridgelines. Dry wash runs north and cuts behind the last ridgeline. If we angle them there, we can reroute around the second field and avoid the contact point. I nodded. "Do it." We broke the column's formation, veering toward the gully. Mila took the lead with Jackson, guiding the families down the slope, warning them not to trip or stumble past the flagged stones. The ground here was littered with rock and debris. There had once been a small barracks here, shelled into oblivion during the 1999 NATO airstrikes. Half a concrete wall jutted from the earth like a broken tooth, graffiti long since faded by wind and rain. We made it into the gully just as the infected crested the hill behind us. They didn't run like people. They didn't track with the same logic as hostiles in a firefight. They charged forward without concern for terrain, without any attempt to shield themselves from barbed wire or brush or even each other. One of them leapt over a cluster of rocks and landed awkwardly, breaking both ankles, but still crawled forward at a horrifying pace, fingernails digging into the clay. And that was the moment I saw the third group. Ahead of us. At the far end of the gully, nearly 30 meters out, another mob of infected was descending into the basin. Some were fresh, clothes still intact, blood not yet dry. Others were old, discolored, limbs slack, movements erratic and twitchy like marionettes with tangled strings. We were boxed in. I didn't even think. I grabbed the PRC-152 from my chest rig and called the drone operators. "Simon, I need eyes on the ravine north of my current location. Are we clear uphill?" There was pause. 5 seconds that felt like a lifetime. Then, "Yes, 10 o'clock from your position. Ridge is clear. There's an exposed utility trench running back toward grid 219. If you move fast, you'll beat them there." "Jackson," I shouted. "Take the left side and punch through. Don't wait, we'll cover you." The Hilux roared to life and tore up the slope, spitting rocks and dust as it charged the ridge. Civilians ran in a staggered panic behind it, some falling, others being dragged by hand. Dom and Andre opened fire, tight and precise, knocking down the lead infected as they scrambled after us. One of the creatures took 37.62 rounds to the chest and still moved, only dropping when the fourth shot struck it square in the orbital socket. Mila climbed halfway up the slope and knelt, laying down, suppressing fire with her AUG in short bursts. She didn't miss. I sprinted toward the last straggler, a woman carrying her daughter, grabbed the child, and half-dragged them up the trench. Behind us, the infected were pouring into the gully like floodwater through a broken levee. Their coordination was non-existent, but their momentum and sheer number overwhelmed any tactical advantage we had. They stumbled over rock and rebar, threw themselves across jagged concrete and landed hard in the dust, but none of them stayed down. Broken ribs, twisted limbs, gouged flesh, it didn't matter. They just kept coming. The woman stumbled beside me. Her knees buckled and she fell forward with a dry, ragged cough. Her face was pale, too pale. When I reached back to help her, I saw the blood, dark and arterial, soaking her shirt from beneath the jacket, a jagged puncture wound below the ribs. She looked up at me, eyes glazed, and nodded once. Not a word. Just that nod. I hesitated only a second, then picked up the girl, light as a bag of flour, and ran. Dom and Andrich held the ridge until we cleared it, firing controlled bursts downhill before they broke contact and followed, sweat and smoke streaming from their gear. Jackson had already positioned the Hilux on the opposite slope with the rear door open. Mila covered the final sprint while Lana rushed in to check the civilians as they dropped behind the last sandbag line. When I turned around and looked back across the basin, the infected were already climbing the slope we'd just left. I counted at least 40. Some moved fast, arms swinging in long, uneven strides. Others crawled on all fours like dogs. One, barefoot, its scalp torn open to reveal gray bone, leapt over a crumbled wall section and landed so hard its knee twisted sideways. It just kept going. We couldn't stop here. The only option now was the tower. The old watchtower had been part of a Yugoslav border control station in the late 80s. After the conflict ended, it was abandoned, picked clean by scavengers, and finally welded shut when it was designated as part of the demilitarized exclusion zone. Our team had repurposed it as a fallback point, reinforcing the lowest level with sandbags and welding steel braces across the interior door frames. The gate surrounding it had been repaired 2 weeks prior with tensioned fencing, tripwire alarms, and steel mesh barriers. We thought it would hold. But as we approached, it was obvious something, or someone, had already tested it. The main gate was torn open. The mesh fencing had been peeled back from the top corner, exposing a jagged gap just wide enough for a person to crawl through. Blood was smeared along the torn edges, dark, dried, and unmistakably human. The secondary barrier had been pushed inward and collapsed like a house of cards. Simon's voice came over the radio. Drone feed shows multiple contacts around the tower. No heat signatures inside the upper level, but the lower floor is unclear. I've got at least 6 figures loitering at the north perimeter. Can't confirm if they're infected or alive. We couldn't afford a standoff. The infected behind us were closing the gap. I turned to the group, civilians wide-eyed and soaked in sweat. Kids clinging to mothers, elders collapsed in the shade of the Hilux. We had only a few minutes to make a call. Mila, Dom, stack left. Jackson, you and Andre sweep right. I'll take point. We go hard and fast. If they're in the tower, we clear it." Mila raised her rifle and nodded once. Jackson pulled his sidearm, having holstered the rifle for CQB work. We moved as one. The tower doors were unlatched, hanging crooked on bent hinges. I led the breach, sweeping with the M9 at low ready. The entry hallway was smeared with blood but empty. Broken furniture lay scattered in the corners, and a metallic smell hung in the air. Old rust mixed with something sharper, rot layered over decay. We cleared the first floor in under a minute. No contacts, just signs of panic. A spilled can of beans, a cracked GPS unit, a child's doll soaked in something unidentifiable. The upper floors were more intact, though dust-choked and hot enough to sting the eyes. We found a few blankets, water bottles, and a broken radio rig. Someone had tried to make this a shelter, but they didn't last long. "Clear," I said over the radio. "Get the civvies inside. Block all lower entries. Dom, bring the sandbags up. Mila, start reinforcing the stairwell access. Jackson, get eyes on the approach vector. I want warning before we're flanked." As the rest of the crew moved into position, I walked back outside to meet Lena. She was kneeling beside the woman I'd helped carry, now laying on her back, shallow breath rattling in her lungs. The little girl I'd pulled free was sitting beside her, clutching her hand and crying silently. "She's not going to make it," Lena said, her voice low. "Puncture through the lower left lung. Internal bleeding. No supplies to treat it here. I can ease the pain, but—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. I looked at the woman. She met my eyes, and this time, her lips moved. "Zastiti J," she whispered. "Protect her." I nodded. She squeezed the girl's hand one last time, then closed her eyes and went still. The child didn't scream, just leaned into her mother's side and pressed her forehead into her chest, rocking back and forth without a sound. The infected reached the lower gate less than 20 minutes later. At first, they came in ones and twos, staggering along the gravel path with arms swinging and heads twitching. Then, in a wave, a mass of gray torn flesh and lifeless eyes crashing against the outer fence like a tide against a seawall. Their bodies piled up as they pressed forward, trampling the fallen underfoot, reaching and clawing without thought or exhaustion. Mila opened fire from the top window, short, controlled bursts from her rifle dropping the lead figures. Jackson called targets from below while Andre and Dom cycled between suppressive fire and spot checks on the east side. We held them off for as long as we could, but we were low on ammo. The tower hadn't been stocked for a siege, just fall back, regroup, and retreat. We had only a few crates of 5.56 and 7.62, a case of 9mm, and a handful of M67s. I had 2 claymores still in the Hilux, but no time to set them up safely. As the sun dropped lower, the situation worsened. One of the infected had made it under the fencing, crawling beneath the wreckage of the collapsed gate. It didn't make a sound, just slithered, like some twisted animal. Jackson spotted it just as it reached the inner sandbag line. A quick double tap to the skull stopped it cold, but the message was clear. The perimeter would not hold much longer. We needed a way out. Simon came through with a solution. "Eric, we're seeing something on the drone feed, about 800 meters east, near the old transformer station. There's a vehicle. Looks intact, looks like military. Maybe old KFOR or Serb Army tech. Can't confirm fuel status, but it's upright. No major rust visible." "What kind of vehicle?" "Looks like an Iveco LMV, armored. 5-seater minimum." That changed everything. If the vehicle was functional, it could punch through whatever blockade remained. It had a raised air intake, possibly fording capabilities, and enough armor to withstand low-level shrapnel if the field flared again. We'd have a shot at escape. But getting there meant cutting across open terrain through what had once been an uncleared sector. Minefield Delta 4. Unmapped, no safe path, no flagged corridor. Pure risk. I stepped back from the window and looked at the team. They didn't ask. They didn't argue. They just waited. "We prep everyone to move," I said. "Simon will guide us from above, thermal and LiDAR scans. We go light, 1 bag each, only essentials. The rest gets left behind." "What about the kids?" Lena asked quietly. "They ride in the Hilux. Android drives. I'll lead on foot with Jackson and Mila. Dom covers rear. Simon, you keep the drone over us at all times. If you lose us, we go dark and we're dead." Everyone nodded, tight-lipped. No one wasted breath. Time was already bleeding away. The sun had dropped below the ridge, casting long shadows across the compound. In the fading orange light, the infected looked almost unreal, like crude puppets animated by strings of muscle and blind instinct. But they were real. We could hear them slamming against the fencing on the western side, bodies piling, bones breaking, snarls building into something like a frenzied chant. If they breached that fence fully, the tower would fall in minutes. We couldn't wait for morning, couldn't pray for airlift, couldn't hold out for anything except the hope of a vehicle we hadn't confirmed would even start. We moved. The Hilux started with a cough and a growl, headlights off. Andre was already at the wheel, engine idling low. Lena sat in the back seat with the 2 youngest children and the teenage girl. One of the elderly men refused to leave his wife's side and stayed behind in the tower. His choice, made in silence, eyes locked on the crucifix in his hands. I didn't try to talk him out of it. I'd seen that look before. We exited through the east trench, our emergency egress point. The tower's perimeter lights flickered behind us, still powered by a small diesel generator and a row of solar batteries we'd installed weeks ago. As soon as we were 50 meters out, the night dropped around us like a hammer. The temperature fell, but not enough to offer relief, just enough to tighten the sweat in our clothes and sting our eyes as the dust kicked up. Simon's voice cut in, clear and low through the radio. "You're approaching Delta 4, switching to thermal and terrain scan overlay. Minimal vegetation. No recent disturbances detected along the east quadrant. You'll pass within 70 meters of an unflagged munitions zone, former aerial cluster drop. Watch your step." I switched to NVGs, the green glow amplifying the edges of the terrain. We'd mapped the edges of Delta 4 from satellite data and old UN minefield reports, but there had never been boots-on-the-ground clearance. Too risky, too unstable. We were walking into a black hole of forgotten ordnance and unforgiving topography. The ground changed almost immediately. No longer the semi-packed gravel of cleared corridors, but loose earth littered with bone-dry vegetation, warped metal fragments, and subtle craters. Some no larger than a footstep, others the size of an engine block. The war had left this place broken, and nature hadn't healed it, only buried it under silence. We moved in staggered formation, myself at the point, Jackson 10 meters to the left, Mila ghosting between us with her rifle angled low, scanning for tripwires or signs of buried plates. Dom trailed last, turning every 10 paces to sweep our 6 with his red-filtered tack light. The Hilux crept behind us in low gear, tires crunching softly on the gravel. At 300 meters in, the radio clicked again. "Eric," Simon said. "You've got new contacts northeast slope. 5 heat signatures closing slowly. 20 degrees off your path, estimated distance 250 meters. Likely infected." I slowed, held up a fist. Everyone froze. We dropped into a crouch and waited. The Hilux idled, engine rattling in the stillness. Nothing. Then a branch snapped somewhere in the dark, then another, the faint scuff of dragging feet. I looked up and saw movement across the slope. A figure staggering over a ridge, then vanishing into shadow. No lights, no sound. Just movement, like wind-blown scarecrows. They didn't seem to see us, or maybe the heat of the vehicle was throwing off their trail. Either way, we weren't staying. We resumed the march. We made it another 150 meters before we hit the first real obstacle. A rusted-out chain-link fence half buried in scrub and buckled from erosion. It had been part of a checkpoint long ago, or maybe a UN exclusion line. There were faded NATO signs buried in the dust. Danger UXO area not cleared. Below that, a discolored rectangle where a Serbian warning plaque had been torn off. I spotted the remains of a tripwire strung between two steel rods, the wire corroded but still faintly visible in the night vision. It ended at a broken Prom 1 bounding mine shell, the arming mechanism shattered. I signaled halt again and pulled out the mini thermal scope. Ground scans showed cold, undisturbed earth ahead. No signs of recent movement, but there were dozens of possible blast sites within the next 50 meters. Craters, soil seams, and a dozen odd mounds that could have been the aftermath of decayed ordnance or something much worse. Mila moved up next to me, crouching low. We need to swing wide, right side. That ridge is more stable. I nodded. We rerouted. As we crossed the fence line, I caught the glint of a dog tag half buried in the dirt. U.S. Army, likely from one of the joint clearance teams that came through in the early 2000s. A cold shiver passed through me. We weren't the first ones to risk this route, but we might be the last. Simon pinged us again. You're 220 meters from the transformer station. The vehicle's still there. No heat signatures. No movement. Feeds are clear. You're coming up on a low gully, 15 meters wide with 3 potential plate zones. Proceed slowly. The ground sloped down and leveled into a wide depression. Years ago, it had been a water runoff trench. Now, it was just broken ground and dried mud. I stepped first, carefully testing each patch with the weighted probe rod I'd carried since my early Army days. Jackson followed with a mine prod, sweeping in slow arcs. We were halfway across when the silence was broken. Not a scream, not a growl. It was a sound like bones clattering in a bag, fast, erratic footfalls through rock, then a moan, wet, hoarse, rising in pitch until it cracked like a dying animal's cry. Infected, north slope, closing fast, Dom's voice. I turned in time to see 3 of them crest the ridge, limbs flailing, feet catching loose rocks as they tore down slope. Their skin was pallid and open in places. One was missing an eye, another had a protruding spinal column like a broken exoskeleton. They weren't alone. More were behind them. 10, 15, we were boxed again. Run, I shouted. Go, stay in the trench. If you step wide, you die. The group broke into a sprint, the Hilux surging forward, its engine howling now as Andre slammed the gas. Civilians screamed. Children clutched the door frames. One of the elderly men fell, and Dom scooped him up without slowing. The infected were closing, their snarls building to a horrible crescendo behind us. We reached the far side just as Mila dropped to one knee and fired. Her shot cracked across the basin and took the lead infected in the neck, sending it sprawling. Jackson lobbed flashbang and the hilltop exploded in white light and smoke, buying us precious seconds. We pulled up behind the transformer station's outer fence and rushed to the vehicle. It was an Iveco LMV, just like Simon said. Faded UN markings, Rear hatch intact, side glass cracked but secure. It had been abandoned in a hurry, but the tires were inflated and the engine looked dry. And then, miracle. It started. A single turn of the key in the ignition and the diesel rumbled to life like a resurrected giant. We didn't waste a second. I jumped into the passenger side. Jackson mounted the rear hatch gun. Mila climbed in next to him. Dom crammed into the back with the civilians. Andre parked the Hilux at an angle, set the throttle wide open and locked the steering with a rope. He slapped the hood twice, then ran. The Hilux tore off into the field like a ghost rider, lights on, engine screaming. The infected took the bait. They swarmed after it, drawn like moths to flame, dozens of them chasing the machine into the scrub. One of them triggered something. A PMR-2 mine, maybe. The blast lit the sky and sent bodies spinning through the air. Then another. The Hilux had served its final purpose as bait and trap. We drove. We didn't stop until we crossed the final barrier, a rusted rail line that marked the outer edge of the old conflict zone. Beyond that, the terrain opened up into a valley. No mines, no fences, no towers. Just dark, empty land under a fading moon. I slumped in the seat, hands shaking, eyes raw from dust and sweat. Behind us, the infected swarmed the ruins, snarling into the empty night. We didn't look back. There was no reason to. We reached a KF-4 checkpoint outside Podujevo at dawn. The guards were already on alert, faces grim behind ballistic shields and thermal goggles. They waved us through after a tense inspection. We gave statements. Medical teams took the civilians. We were debriefed, then quarantined. Blood tests, psychological evaluations, photos of the infected. No one said the word zombie, but no one said anything else that made more sense either. Mila sat beside me the next night, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of cold coffee. "Do you think it's over?" she asked. I stared at the wall, thinking of that minefield, of the torn fence, the broken gate, the black eyes of those things in the dark. "No," I said. "I think it's just starting." Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.